I was born on a cold January morning in Riyadh under the weight of a name that, to the outside world, signified absolute power, but to me it was always a chain of fine gold. My home was not a house, but a complex of palaces in the exclusive diplomatic quarter, surrounded by walls so high that the horizon existed only in my imagination. I grew up among imported marbles, fountains that whispered in the night, and the constant aroma of incense and expensive perfumes. But in the midst of all that opulence, I was a shadow moving through silent hallways. The wealth of the Al Saud family is something most cannot even begin to visualize. It is an abundance that suffocates as much as it does. However, behind every security camera and every armed guard, what was truly hidden was my lack of freedom. Every step I took was calculated by others. Every desire was filtered through my father's will, and every dream was a silent transgression that only I knew in the solitude of my room, where luxury was my jailer. Before continuing, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you don't miss any testimony, and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now, let's get back to the testimony. My education was a process of relentless molding, designed to turn me into the perfect Saudi woman of the elite, a decorative figure to honor the lineage of Abdullah bin Faisal Al Saud. From the age of 6, the abaya was my second skin, and at 10, the niqab hid my face from the world, leaving only my eyes to observe a reality that did not belong to me. Ustada Hamuna, my religious instructor, etched into my mind the memorization of the Quran and the principles of Wahhabi Islam, with a severity that left no room for doubt. I was taught that my voice should be a whisper and my will a reflection of obedience. While my brothers studied abroad, I remained confined among private tutors who came to the palace to teach me under the watchful eye of my mother. Latifa, my mother, was the enforcement arm of that control, a woman who loved through surveillance, reminding me in every gesture that I was a symbol of the family and that any stain on my behavior would be an irreparable tragedy. Religion was the rhythm that marked my days, but for me, it was a mechanical dance, devoid of any real spark of spiritual life. I would rise before dawn, with the echo of the call to prayer resonating in the complex, perform the wudu with robotic precision, and prostrate for fajr, feeling that my words hit the ceiling and fell back to the floor. I fulfilled the 5 pillars with impeccable perfection, fasted during Ramadan until hunger made me dizzy, and recited verses in grammatically perfect Arabic. But my soul felt like a dry desert that no ablution could refresh. There was an unbearable void in the center of my chest, a crack that grew with every passing year, making me question if faith was simply a series of obligations and social performances. I was an expert in appearance, a princess who fulfilled every rite. But inside I was a castaway desperately searching for a shore that did not appear on the maps of my official religion. The breaking point began the day my father, with the coldness of one closing a business deal, announced my engagement to Prince Mansur bin Solomon. It was not a conversation. It was a decree that sealed my fate with a man 20 years older than me, whom I had barely seen a few times, and who looked at me as one looks at a valuable but inert piece of property. In that moment, I felt the palace walls closing in on me for good, and it was then that I sought refuge in the only place no one could watch, the world of dreams. I decided to use my training in psychology to delve into onorology scientifically, secretly enrolling in a distance learning program using my own savings and presenting it to my father as a harmless specialization for my charitable work. I did not know that this academic curiosity about the subconscious would be the thread that would unravel the entire tapestry of my existence, leading me to leave the palace in disguise to conduct research that would change everything. To obtain real data for my research on the science of dreams, I knew I could not appear as Princess Amira. If I arrived in a royal convoy, people would only tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. So, I articulated a plan for a temporary escape from my own identity. I borrowed simple, cheap abayas from one of our housekeeper's pieces, without embroidery or luxury, and used a basic niqab that hid any trace of wealth. I asked my driver to drop me off in public places, like libraries and parks, and to wait at a distance. For the first time in my life, I was anonymous, a shadow among shadows in the crowds of Riyadh. That invisibility was intoxicating freedom I had never felt before. Walking among common people, carrying only a clipboard and a pen, made me feel, ironically, much more powerful than when I was surrounded by security guards. I was just a university student diving into the souls of strangers without titles or walls. The pattern that would change my existence began to reveal itself subtly in a public library in Riyadh. I approached a woman named Fatima, a teacher who seemed tense under her veil. When the conversation turned to unusual dream experiences, she hesitated, looked around to ensure no one was listening, and whispered about a recurring dream that haunted and, at the same time, consoled her. She described a man dressed in white, whose tunic seemed to emit its own light, standing in a place of absolute peace. He had Middle Eastern features, dark hair, and eyes that overflowed with a compassion she had never seen. The most disturbing part was the phrase he said in perfect and powerful Arabic. Fatima, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Come to me and I will give you rest. She woke up crying, feeling an overwhelming love. In that moment, I recorded everything with scientific rigor, thinking it was an isolated case of stress or cultural influence, having no idea what was to come. 2 days later, in a park north of the capital, the coincidence became a chill down my spine. I interviewed a young engineering student named Ahmed. When I asked about significant dreams, his reaction was a mirror of Fatima's hesitation, fear, and then an almost identical account. He described the same man in white, the same unbearable brightness, and the exact same words. Ahmed was sobbing as he spoke, asking me if I thought it was a message from God or a deception. My brain, trained in the science of dreams, tried to find a logical explanation, such as collective hysteria or a phenomenon of the Saudi social unconscious. But the precision of the details was statistically impossible. To people with no connection, in different locations, reporting the same figure and the same specific sentence. I felt my heart racing against my ribs with every word he said, realizing that something was breaking through the barriers of reality, expanding my research to Jeddah, Mecca, and Medina. What was once an anomaly became a documented spiritual invasion on my clipboard. Out of 300 people interviewed, more than 100 reported the same dream. It didn't matter the social class or age. From a taxi driver to a devoted grandmother, the story repeated itself. Some said the man showed them wounds in his hands and feet. Others heard that he had died for them. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. As a researcher, I searched everything: TV programs, social media, any external source that could have planted those images in the people's minds, but there was nothing. What those people were describing did not come from the Quran, but from something I did not yet know. When I asked who they thought the man was, the answer was almost always a fearful whisper: Isa al-Masih, Jesus. The prophet whom Islam claimed was merely a man was appearing in the bedrooms of Saudis as something much greater. The night I decided to research those words was the beginning of the end of my life as I knew it. I locked my bedroom door in the palace, turned on my laptop, and activated the VPN to bypass Saudi government censorship. Feeling a cold fear run through my spine, I typed a phrase that wouldn't stop echoing in the reports: I am the way, the truth, and the life. In fractions of a second, the results flooded the screen, and what I saw took my breath away. It was a biblical verse, John 14:6. Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. My hands began to shake so much that I had to pull them away from the keyboard. Those people, devout Saudis, who had never touched a Bible, were dreaming the exact words of the Gospel of John. How was that possible? The shock was physical, a vertigo that made me feel as if the marble floor of my room was giving way. I wasn't just facing a statistical anomaly. I was facing something impossible to explain by neuroscience or human logic. I kept digging, ignoring exhaustion and the danger of being discovered by some internal monitoring. I found thousands of accounts from Muslims across the Middle East, Iraq, Egypt, Turkey describing identical visions and dreams. It wasn't just in Saudi Arabia. It was a silent, supernatural invasion that had been occurring for decades. I read testimonies of former Muslims who, after these dreams, had secretly converted, risking their own lives for a peace I had never known. Some research indicated that up to 80% of conversions in our region began with this type of manifestation. The world I built on logic and science was falling apart. I saw videos of women who had worn the niqab their whole lives and were now talking about a love that had freed them from fear. With every click, the structure of my reality cracked a little more. What I was witnessing was not a collective delusion. It was a real presence, calling people by name. I felt small and terrified before the magnitude of what I was discovering under the roof of the royal palace. I began reading the exile, the New Testament, in Arabic, through hidden websites. At first, the familiarity with the names of Mary and Isa calmed me, but as I advanced, the text became an affront to everything I had been taught. There, Jesus was not just a subordinate prophet, he forgave sins, which only God could do. He said, "I and the Father are one." The description of the crucifixion was the most painful point of the reading. In Islam, we are taught that God would never allow his prophet to suffer such humiliation, that Allah took him to heaven and put someone else in his place. But in the Gospel, the suffering was detailed, raw, and full of a purpose I couldn't immediately understand. Why would a God allow himself to be nailed to a cross? Why would he forgive those who killed him while he bled? Islamic theology is based on sovereignty and power, but what I was reading spoke of a God who became vulnerable out of love. It was a scandal, to my mind, raised in Wahhabism, a violent conflict between centuries of tradition and the truth jumping off those forbidden pages. The concept of salvation by grace and not by works was the final blow to my resistance. In Islam, we live on the scales, the constant fear that our good deeds will not weigh enough on the day of judgment. There is no certainty, only incessant effort and blind hope in Allah's mercy. But in John 3:16, I read that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that whoever believed in him would have eternal life. A gift. It wasn't something I needed to earn with mechanical prayers or exhausting fasts. It was something I only needed to receive. I sat on the floor, in the dark, tears streaming down my face and staining my abaya. I was terrified. I knew that if I believed in that, I would lose everything. My name, my family, my country, and most likely, my life. In Saudi Arabia, apostasy is punished by death. The government executes those who abandon Islam, and families wash their honor with blood. I was facing an impossible choice: save my soul and face the executioner, or keep my luxury and continue dying inside. The weight of this decision was a burden I could no longer bear alone. During the 3 months following the discovery of the online Bible, my life became an incessant internal battlefield. By day, I was the perfect Princess Amira, the obedient daughter my father displayed as a trophy of modesty and culture. I attended gala dinners, smiled at Prince Mansur while my stomach churned in disgust, and discussed the preparations for a wedding that I knew, in the depths of my being, would never happen. The most difficult part was the religious ritual. Every time I bowed toward Mecca, I felt the weight of hypocrisy crushing my lungs. Reciting the Shahada, "There is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger," had become physical torture. I felt a lump in my throat, a desire to scream that all of it was an empty shell. I performed every movement, every ablution, and every prayer with surgical precision to avoid arousing suspicion. But my heart no longer inhabited those marble mosques. I was a stranger in my own home, a prisoner guarding a secret capable of setting the entire Al-Saud lineage ablaze. The loneliness was absolute, an abyss I dug every night as I read the Gospels hidden under silk sheets. While the rest of the palace slept in a golden ignorance I could no longer share, I concluded my research project on the science of dreams with a bitter feeling of triumph. I gathered more than 300 testimonies, and statistically, the data was overwhelming. 35% of the people interviewed reported the same supernatural encounter with the figure of Isa. I wrote my final thesis with full academic rigor, titling it "Recurring Archetypal Figures in Contemporary Saudi Dream Patterns, a Statistical Analysis." I sent the work to the university in London and received the highest grade, accompanied by enthusiastic praise from my professor for the depth of the fieldwork. He had no idea that those graphs and tables represented the end of my religious sanity. From a scientific standpoint, It was an absolute impossibility. There was no external source, radio program, or cultural influence that explained such uniformity in such a monitored and isolated population. The evidence was there, documented on my clipboard, screaming a truth I tried to silence with logic. If all those people were seeing the same person, if he was calling each one by name and repeating words they had never read, then Jesus was alive. He wasn't just a figure in an old book or a minor prophet in a sacred text. He was an active, real, and dangerous presence to the status quo of my entire nation. The research that was supposed to validate my academic career ended up validating my own condemnation under Saudi law. The night of my definitive encounter happened in late November, a moment when the exhaustion of living two lives pushed me to my absolute limit. My family had left for a private resort on the outskirts of Riyadh for a short holiday, but I used the pretext of finishing my studies to stay alone in the palace. The silence in the corridors was deep, interrupted only by the distant hum of the air conditioning. I locked my bedroom door, leaned my back against the bed, and collapsed onto the marble floor. I could no longer breathe under the weight of the mask I wore. I felt I was being torn in half between the comfort of my lineage and the truth burning in my hands. I thought of my father's face, my mother's shame, and the mortal danger surrounding me. It was there, in the dim light of that luxurious room, that I decided to do something that felt like the final sacrilege. I did not turn toward Mecca. I did not perform the ritual washings. I simply knelt and whispered into the darkness, Jesus, if you are truly real, if you are the Son of God and the only way, show me. I can no longer live in this lie. I am afraid, but I am desperate. Please, reveal yourself to me. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, waiting in the dark, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. Desperation was my only guide, a silent cry for proof I didn't know if I deserved or could bear to receive. What happened next defies any logical description, but it was the most real experience of my entire existence. Slowly, I began to feel a strange warmth in my chest, a feeling that the very density of the air in the room was changing. Suddenly, in the corner near the window, a soft light emerged that began to grow with an intensity I had never seen in nature. It wasn't a lamp or a reflection. It was a living, pulsing clarity that filled every crack of the room until the shadows completely disappeared. And then, from the center of that light, he appeared. A man dressed in white, whose robes seemed made of pure brilliance, standing in the center of my room in the royal palace of Riyadh. I should have screamed in terror, but what I felt was a peace so deep that my bones seemed to melt. His face was difficult to look at directly because of the radiance, but his eyes were abysses of compassion and love, something I never found in any human being. I fell face down, trembling, unable to lift my head. Then I heard his voice. It wasn't an external sound, but something that resonated within every cell of my body. He spoke my name in Arabic, Amira. It was just one word, but in it was contained the recognition of my entire life, of every hidden tear and every empty prayer I had ever made. He knew who I was, and in that moment, I knew my search had ended. I felt my spirit being pulled from my physical body with a force that was not of this world. I looked to you in a split second and saw my own body prostrate, motionless on the marble floor of the room. Then, I was in a place that human language fails miserably to describe. Light was everywhere, but it wasn't like the sunlight that burns. It was a light that nourished, full of vibrant colors that do not exist on the earthly spectrum, tones that seemed to have sound and life. I heard music that wasn't made of instruments, but of thousands of voices in a harmony so perfect that every note vibrated inside my soul, a worship that filled the very air. Jesus was by my side, and as we walked through that realm of absolute peace, I saw beings of light and multitudes from every nation, all radiant and full of unspeakable joy. In the center of everything, there was a throne of unbearable glory, surrounded by a brightness that emanated the very essence of life and justice. He showed me an immense and golden book, the Book of Life. When Jesus opened it, I saw names written in a calligraphy of pure light. He pointed to a page, and there, engraved with an eternal glow, I saw my own name, Amira, bint Abdullah al-Sa. The shock was so profound that I sobbed. He knew me before the foundation of the world. My name was there, in that sanctuary of love, long before I even existed on earth. The scene changed in the blink of an eye, and the indescribable beauty gave way to absolute and visceral horror. The light vanished, and I was plunged into a darkness so dense it felt like physical weight on my shoulders. The air suddenly became hot, suffocating, and fetid, smelling of sulfur, burning, and decomposition. I heard piercing screams, wails of an agony so deep it seemed to tear through space, sounds of people in a despair that would never end. Jesus remained by my side, but his face was now marked by an infinite sadness, a divine sorrow I will never forget. He showed me what hell was, the place of total and eternal separation from God. I saw faces I recognized with dread, people who in my world were considered holy and untouchable. Devotees who spent their lives in mosques, scholars and charitable men of the Saudi elite. They cried out that they had done everything right, that they had followed the rules. But the response that echoed in that abyss was that they had rejected the Son, trusting only in their own merits and empty works. I saw a distant relative who had died 2 years ago, famous for her rigorous Islamic piety, suffering in a torment that made me want to tear out my own eyes so as not to see. It wasn't a place of arbitrary punishment, but the tragic and final result of those who choose to walk deliberately away from the only source of life. Terror paralyzed me completely. I couldn't run, only observe the terrible fate of those who rejected the invitation of love. We returned to my room in the palace as fast as we had left that dimension. I was back on the floor, panting, my face drenched in tears and my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal. Jesus was still before me. The light was decreasing in intensity, but his presence still filled every inch of that luxurious room, making the gold furniture look like worthless trash. He looked deep into my eyes and made the invitation I knew would cost my head but save my soul. Amira, will you follow me? Will you give me your life, no matter the cost? I knew exactly what that meant in Saudi Arabia. It meant civil death, the total loss of my family, the erasure of my name, and the real risk of the executioner in the public square. But after what my eyes had seen, the choice was no longer difficult. The world had lost its luster. I looked at him and answered with all the strength of my soul, in a cry that was both a relief. Yes, I will follow you. I believe that you are the Son of God. Forgive me for rejecting you for so long. My life is entirely yours. At the exact moment the words came out, I felt something physical break inside me. It was as if invisible and very heavy chains, which had bound me since birth, were shattered by an invisible hammer. The burden of guilt, the existential void, and the constant fear I carried disappeared. I was flooded by a peace that passes understanding, a lightness I never imagined possible for a human being. I had been washed, rescued, and adopted by a king much greater than any else. When the sun rose over Riyadh the next morning, I looked in the mirror and saw the same princess face, but the eyes now belonged to a completely different person. I had died and been resurrected that night. The call to prayer began to echo in the nearby mosques, but for the first time in my life, I did not feel obliged to follow that mechanical and soulless ritual. Instead of prostrating toward Mecca, I knelt beside my bed and prayed in my own words, speaking with Jesus as if he were sitting there with me, because I knew he was. My family returned from the resort that afternoon, and my mother commented, surprised, that I seemed brighter, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from me. I had to lie, saying it was just the relief of finishing my academic studies, while inside I burned with a truth that could reduce that palace to ashes. I began living an extremely dangerous double life. By day, the abaya, the niqab, and the Islamic rites were my necessary camouflage to avoid being killed. At night, I was a fervent disciple, devouring the forbidden gospel in the dark on my tablet. But I knew that loneliness couldn't last forever. I needed others. I needed to know I wasn't the only Christian in that arid and watched land. I began to revisit my research data with different eyes, looking for signs for those who had also dreamed of the man in white, in the desperate hope of finding a church hidden in the shadows of the Saudi capital. The loneliness of being the only follower of Jesus in a palace full of guards was a burden I could no longer carry alone. In the silence of my nights, I obsessively returned to my academic research data, but not with the eyes of a scientist, rather with the desperation of a castaway looking for other survivors. I knew there were people there, in the middle of Riyadh, who had seen what I saw. I spent hours rereading the testimonies until a name jumped off the pages. Ella, she was a teacher about 30 years old, who had described the dream with a spiritual clarity that had chilled me at the time. She had left a contact number, saying that if I wanted to understand more, I should look for her. With sweaty hands and a racing heart, I installed an encrypted messaging app and created a false identity. I wrote a short message, weighing every word as if it were a bomb. Hello, I am the I have been thinking a lot about what you shared. I would like to talk again in a safe place. The time I spent waiting for the reply was an eternity of uncertainty and silent prayers under the royal roof. 2 days later, we met in the women's section of the Riyadh Park Mall, a place where the constant murmur of hundreds of women in black ABIs created a perfect sound veil for secrets. I sat in a small cafe and saw Ela approach. When our eyes met behind the niqabs, there was an immediate recognition that logic cannot explain. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly on the plastic table. We were cautious at first, talking about pleasantries, but the tension was almost electric. Then, I leaned forward and whispered the truth that could destroy us. Ella, I also had the dream. I saw the man in white. He called me by name. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of my own breathing. She froze for an instant, and then her eyes filled with tears that began to wet the black fabric of her veil. She squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of brotherhood that was worth more than all my father's gold. I am not the only one, she whispered back, with a voice loaded with relief so deep it felt like an outpouring. In that moment, I discovered I wasn't just an isolated princess. I had a sister. Ayla told me about the existence of an invisible network, a church pulsing under the skin of Saudi Arabia. She gave me the instructions for the next meeting, which would take place on Friday afternoon. There was a poetic and dangerous irony in this. While the entire nation headed to the mosques for the mandatory communal prayer, we, the followers of Isa, would take advantage of that vacuum of domestic surveillance to meet. On the appointed Friday, I pretended to have a terrible migraine to avoid going with my mother to the traditional women's prayers. When the palace went silent after their departure, I put on my humblest abaya and left alone something that required a risky maneuver with the side gate guards I had known since childhood. I took a taxi to a modest residential neighborhood in eastern Riyadh. I walked through narrow streets, feeling every pair of imaginary eyes on my back until I reached the apartment building. I followed the knocking code Ayla taught me. 3 quick knocks, a pause, and 2 more. The door opened just a crack, revealing the tense face of a woman who pulled me inside with an agility that betrayed the habit of constant fear. Inside that small, stuffy apartment, what I found was the true kingdom of God on earth. There were about 12 people sitting in a circle on the floor, men and women, young and old, all Saudis who had traded the safety of conformity for the uncertainty of forbidden faith. In the center of the circle was Ibrahim, a man with graying hair and kind eyes that exuded a spiritual authority I had never seen in any royal imam. He opened what appeared to be a copy of the Quran, but inside, the pages were of an Arabic Bible, dangerous and brilliant disguise to fool any sudden inspection. We began to sing, but it wasn't a normal song. It was a collective whisper, a muffled melody that filled the room with a reverence that made me cry instantly. Those people weren't there out of tradition or social pressure. They were there because, like me, they had been touched by a love that surpassed the fear of death. Ibrahim began reading Romans 8, about how nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Every word seemed like a balm for the wounds of my soul. I was a princess, but there, on that worn carpet floor, I was finally equal to everyone, just a rescued daughter, sharing the bread of life in the secret shadows of Riyadh. The baptism ceremony in the bathroom of that apartment was the most sacred moment of my life. Ibrahim filled the bathtub while the group gathered around in a silence charged with an almost electric expectation. I removed my abaya, staying in a simple and modest dress, and entered the cold water, feeling every pore of my body react to the thermal shock. I remember the contrast between the freezing marble and the warmth of the prayer filling the room. Ibrahim asked me with a firm and solemn voice, if I renounced my past and if I accepted Jesus as my one and sufficient Savior. My response was a yes that echoed from deep in my gut, a cry of freedom stifled by years of oppression. As I was fully submerged, I felt as if centuries of empty tradition and the shadow of my lineage were being washed from me. Under the water, time seemed to stop and the noise of the world went silent. When I emerged, gasping and crying, I heard the whispers of Allahu Akbar from my brothers, but now the meaning was, God is great for having rescued one more sheep for his kingdom. I was no longer safe. The princess died there, and a new creature, free and loved, was born in that water. The following months were marked by grueling vigilance and a supernatural peace that defied any human logic. I attended the secret meetings every Friday with the caution of a spy, learning that there were thousands of us scattered throughout the kingdom, hidden in luxurious apartments, humble basements, and even isolated tents in the desert. I discovered that the underground church in Saudi Arabia is an invisible network of 50 to 100,000 Christians whom the government desperately tries to stifle, but who grow with every new dream and vision Jesus sends. I lived under the constant risk of being discovered by the religious police, or worse, by my own family, which would mean a summary execution to wash the clan's honor. Every time my father spoke about my future marriage and duties to the lineage, I felt a deathly chill, but I kept a calm and obedient face, trusting that the Lord would make a way where there was no exit. My faith was no longer an academic theory or a scientific curiosity. It was the very air I needed to breathe to keep from suffocating in the golden hypocrisy of the palace. I was being discipled in the fire, discovering that Christ's love is the only force capable of breaking Riyadh's iron barriers. Pressure for the marriage to Prince Mansour became unbearable when the date was officially set for 80 months away. My mother began organizing the trousseau with an excitement that caused me physical nausea, talking about jewelry, expensive fabrics, and colossal banquets. While I could only think about how to escape that endless fate, Mansour represented everything I needed to leave behind. Secular power based on fear, blind submission to a system that denies the divinity of Christ, and a life of lies in a luxury harem. I prayed desperately for Jesus to open a door, even a tiny gap, and the answer came through my academic career. The university in London, where I had presented my study on onorology, invited me to speak at an international conference on the study of dreams and neuroscience. It was the perfect opportunity, the spiritual Trojan horse I needed. When I showed the invitation to my father, he saw it as an honor for the family name, proof that his daughter was a world-class intellectual. He authorized the trip, but on the condition that my cousin Fahad accompany me as my Maram, my legal guardian, and constant shadow. The preparation for the escape was a process of absolute silence and meticulous spiritual strategy through encrypted channels and with Ibrahim's discreet help. I contacted international organizations that assist persecuted Christians in defecting from Islamic regimes. I couldn't write anything on paper, nor leave digital traces on the palace computers. Everything needed to be memorized: phone numbers, meeting locations, and names of contacts who would be waiting for me in London. On my last night in Riyadh, I walked through the palace gardens under the moonlight, observing the marble fountains and imported palm trees for the last time. I felt a deep and agonizing grief for my sister Noor and my mother, knowing that the moment I crossed that border, I would be declared dead and cursed to them. I gathered my essential documents, my passport, and the little money I managed to divert from my personal accounts without raising suspicion among the family auditors. I looked at the absurd luxury around me and realized that none of it had real weight compared to the promise of living in freedom to worship my Savior. I was leaving an earthly kingdom behind, trading my princess crown for a refugee cross, but I never felt so rich. The flight to London on the family's private jet was the longest trip of my life, not in hours, but an emotional wait, sitting in the soft leather armchair, watching the gold clouds through the window. I felt that every kilometer took me away from a slow death and brought me closer to an unknown abyss. My cousin Fahad sat in front of me, reviewing documents on his tablet, personifying the silent vigilance surrounding me. He had no idea that the docile cousin beside him was carrying a digital Bible on her cell phone and a defection plan in her heart. When the plane took off from King Khalid International Airport, I looked at Riyadh disappearing on the horizon and whispered a final goodbye to the girl who had grown up in those palaces. I was leaving the desert, the mandatory prayers, and the name al-Saud behind. I prayed in silence the entire time, asking Jesus to blind Fahad's eyes and to prepare the way ahead. Every bit of turbulence seemed like a reminder of the fragility of my plan. But the peace I had felt in my room months earlier remained there, like an invisible anchor preventing me from collapsing before the time. We arrived in London under a gray sky and a fine rain, a brutal contrast to the dry and scorching heat I had left behind. Fahad settled us in a luxury hotel near the conference center, ensuring our rooms were adjacent so he could monitor my every move. In the isolation of my room, fear tried to suffocate me. I knew Saudi intelligence had eyes everywhere, and any false step would result in my forced return and a terrible fate. I used the encrypted messaging app one last time to confirm the signal. The instructions were clear and chilling. Tomorrow, during the break of your talk, go to the ladies' room. There will be a woman in a blue scarf. Follow her. Leave everything behind except your passport. I looked at my designer suitcases, the jewelry my father had given me, and the expensive perfumes. None of that would come with me. I would leave with only the clothes on my back and the truth that had set me free. I spent the night awake, alternating between the dread of being caught and the anxiety of finally being the owner of my own soul before men. The day of the conference dawned as a blur of nerves and adrenaline. Fahad escorted me to the auditorium, sitting in the last row to watch me as I took the stage to present my research on honorology. My voice was steady, but my hands hidden under the podium shook nonstop. I presented the statistical data on recurring dreams, talking about archetypal figures and neural patterns, while inside I screamed the name of Jesus. As soon as I finished, the moderator announced a break. I looked at Fahad, signaled that I needed to go to the toilet, and walked with steps that felt like they weighed tons. I entered the ladies' room, and there she was, the woman in the blue scarf. Our eyes met in the mirror, and she just nodded. Without saying a word, she guided me through a service door in the back, down a narrow and dark corridor used by the cleaning staff, away from the hall where Fahad was waiting. We exited through a side door into a damp alley where a black car was running. I got into the back seat and, as the vehicle pulled away sharply, I knew that Princess Amira had just disappeared from the face of the earth forever. We arrived at a safe house in a quiet suburb of London, a simple place that seemed like the most luxurious place in the world because it exuded safety. The woman in the blue scarf introduced herself as Catherine and, as we closed the door, she hugged me with a tenderness I had never received from my own mother. I handed my passport to her, feeling that I was handing over my last physical connection to Saudi Arabia. In that moment, the weight of everything I had done collapsed upon me. I was no longer a princess. I was stateless, a refugee, a woman marked for death by her own blood. I cried for hours, a cry that washed away fear, guilt, and the sadness of knowing that my sister Noor would never speak to me again and that my father would declare me a public demon. Catherine prayed with me out loud, invoking the name of Jesus, and that was the first time I heard my Lord's name pronounced openly, without whispers or fear of walls with ears. I was free, but the price of that freedom was the total erasure of everything I had been for the past 28 years. From that afternoon on, I had no country or title, but I had heaven as a guarantee and a peace that no palace in Riyadh could ever offer me. The news of my disappearance exploded in the Saudi media like a grenade. My father issued an official statement saying I had been kidnapped or was suffering from a mental breakdown. They could not admit the truth. It was an impossible stain on the al-Saud lineage. While I was hidden in that simple house in London, seeing my face on every Arabic news channel, the dread of being found was a constant cold in my stomach. I knew the embassy moved heaven and earth and that the British government suffered colossal political pressure to hand me over. But what hurt me were the videos of my mother crying, saying I had been bewitched. I wanted to tell her I was fine, but I knew that contact would be my death. In that room, without marble, I read Catherine's Bible, feeling that that book had more value than my family's oil reserves. Safety came from the invisible presence that wrapped around me like a warm and protective blanket. I decided that silence was no longer an option. I needed to tell the world the truth before my family's narrative buried me alive. We recorded a video in a makeshift studio in the safe house. I vividly remember the feeling of the lights on my uncovered face without the niqab for the first time before a lens. I felt vulnerable, but there was a strength rising from my chest. I spoke directly to the camera, revealing that I had not been kidnapped, but that I had fled because I found Jesus. I told of the dreams I collected in Riyadh and of my own supernatural experience. The weight of every word seemed to shift something in the spiritual world. I knew that the moment the video was posted, I could never go back. I was burning the golden bridges that linked me to the past. When the camera turned off, I felt a chill all down my spine, a sign that the message no longer belonged to me. I was placing my destiny in God's hands, and for the first time, I felt no fear of what tomorrow would bring. The video went viral in hours, sparking a storm of hate and hope. I received death threats from clerics and was called a traitor in every Riyadh newspaper. But in the midst of that toxic trash, pearls emerged, messages from other Saudis, from people in government, from housewives, and even from religious police, saying they too had seen the man in white. I cried, reading those accounts. It was as if the invisible network I had known was gaining a voice. The realization that my pain and my exile were encouraging thousands of secret siblings gave me a jolt of joy. I wasn't just a runaway princess. I was a witness to an invasion that no security system could contain. The peace that invaded me, knowing that the truth was running free, crossing the borders that I myself had difficulty crossing, was something no luxury ever gave me. I felt that Jesus was using my name, the one my father now tried to erase, to sign a love letter to my people who still live in the shadows. Living as a refugee in London is an experience of stripping away that taught me the real meaning of the word essential. Who had never washed my own clothes was now learning to deal with the simplicity of an ordinary life. Every little thing, like walking freely on a sidewalk without a security guard or entering a church and singing at the top of my lungs, was a victory that left me in shock and gratitude. Asylum was granted after months of interrogations and evidence, and the feeling of having a document that protected me was like receiving a second life. I don't miss the palaces or the status. I only miss the people, the smell of my sister's coffee, and the conversations with you. But whenever grief tried to pull me down, I remembered the glow of that room in Riyadh and the authority in Jesus' voice. The cost of following Christ was everything I possessed on earth, but what I received in return does not fit into any bank account. I knew that the phenomenon I lived through continued to happen, silent and unstoppable, like a tide rising in the dark. The dream invasion in Saudi Arabia is something that gives me deep chills to this day. I received clandestine messages from palace guards, from the high elite women, and from humble workers who saw exactly the same glow I saw. It is a silent and supernatural rescue operation that defies all the geopolitical logic we know. The government in Riyadh is terrified because you cannot imprison the subconscious of an entire people, no matter how hard you try. They reinforce surveillance, monitor communications, and punish baiting. But Jesus enters rooms and huts without asking anyone's permission. I know that as I write this, someone in Riyadh is waking up right now, in shock, with the same words echoing in their mind. I am the way. It is unstoppable. The science I've studied has no categories for this. A neurology explains the biological functioning of the brain, but it does not explain the real encounter with the Creator. It is an invasion of love in a land of fear, a phenomenon that crosses walls and censorships with the ease of a sigh in the dark. The feeling of being marked by Him is something I carry on my skin, like an invisible scar that pulses whenever I feel alone in this exile. Sometimes, the silence of my small London apartment is interrupted by a memory so vivid of that light that my whole body trembles again, as if divine voltage were passing through my nerves. It's not a common memory. It's a physical reactivation of that peace that melted my bones in the royal palace. I look at my hands and I don't see heavy jewelry, but I feel a wealth that no oil reserve in the world could buy. What I lived through was not an episode or a hallucination. It was a reality check with something far above this dimension. This mark changed my appetite for existence. What once seemed vital to me, the title, the respect of the court, the luxury today seems only gray and lifeless. Jesus' light turned off the artificial brilliance of diamonds forever. It's a peace that hurts because of its purity, a certainty that keeps me standing. I am a refugee, but I have never been so free. Even today, I try to understand everything I saw using science, but my degree in onerology is absolutely useless against this. How do you explain a light that doesn't emit physical heat, but burns all the lies of a lifetime in seconds? How do you explain a voice that doesn't use external sound waves, but vibrates inside every cell of your body with absolute authority? I exhaustively studied sleep cycles, brain chemistry, and synapses, but none of that tells why people who have never seen each other dream of the exact same phrase. In a biblical context, they are completely unaware of. The truth is that my logic is too small to contain what is happening. I still feel that awe, that crushing and sacred weight in my chest whenever I close my eyes and remember his touch. There is no neurological explanation for the fact that a princess, trained in the rigor of Wahhabism, switches sides in a single night. The phenomenon is raw, real, and beyond any academic thesis. It is an interruption of my reality by the eternal. The experience simply happened, tore the veil of my life, and as quickly as it appeared, it ceased. There were no long goodbyes or detailed explanations. The light went out, the room went back to normal, and I stayed there on the marble floor with the taste of that peace in my mouth and a hum of absolute silence in my ears. The mystery remains dense, like a fog that my reason cannot dissipate, no matter how hard I try. I feel that the invasion continues out there, that every minute that glow appears again in some dark corner of reality. Without warning, without announcement, only the overwhelming presence of the man in white. My life now is just an echo of that moment. There is no way to prove anything in a lab, and I stopped trying a long time ago. The mark is permanent. The inability to logically explain what I lived is my only certainty, and the phenomenon follows its secret and unstoppable course. The glow simply stopped. The account ends here, exactly at the point where the light left me alone with the truth.
This story proves that there are no walls high enough for those who seek the truth. If the light of Jesus was able to invade the heart of power in Saudi Arabia, what stops him from touching your life and transforming your reality today? I would love to know what you felt upon hearing this testimony. Leave your opinion or share your own experience in the comments, as each account helps strengthen our community. To continue receiving transformative content like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is essential so you don't miss anything coming up. Now, don't stop your journey here. Click on the recommended video appearing on your screen now and continue being impacted by these stories. May God bless you greatly. A hug, and until the next video.